And we drove to all the fishing ports from Long Island south to through Virginia. And we visited all the ports. We interviewed fishermen, the captains. We spoke to processors and other individuals who were responsible for port operations and the like. But we also brought a tape measure with us, and we measured the capacity of the ports and how many vessels they could handle. So that was one part of it. And the other part was then we took an in-depth look at the surf clam fishery. And we said, okay, where are they landing these clams? Where are they harvesting these clams, and where are they landing them? And if we were in charge, if we were just, the king of the surf clam fishery and owned all the vessels, and we wanted to maximize our profits, how did that compare with what the industry was actually doing? So you see in that map with the rudimentary lines on it, we looked at where the centroids of the statistical areas where the clams were being caught, and where they were being landed. And we calculated that distance, and we applied a fuel factor to that to get at the cost of where the clams, how much it was costing to land the clams in a different port. But also, and interestingly, each port had its own price demand equation. If you overwhelmed the port and that port didn't have the facilities to handle the product, you'd get a very low price for your product. If you landed at another port, you'd potentially get a higher price. So there was that trade-off, that a port may be close and you want to land the clams there, but you're going to get a really low price. So this ended up becoming this nonlinear mathematical programming problem. And we solved it. We said, what's the optimum? What's the maximum profit you could make out of these clams? And how is the industry actually operating in relation to that? And what we found, there was a huge disconnect. So we combined that information with the additional biological information about the clam resource, looking at the age structure in the different areas and so on, to see that clams were becoming more abundant, more in the north of the area, and the profitability was more to land clams further north. So those two things combined led us to suggest from the study that, in fact, this was a transitory event, that the forces that were going to work out over the next few years would redistribute the fleet away further north from Ocean City, and therefore there really wasn't a need to significantly expand the port. The other thing you see in that slide is a vessel run aground in Oregon Inlet. And so the other thing that was going on at the time was the Army Corps of Engineers being greatly interested in making sure certain channels were open, were dredged, to allow the development of fishing ports like Wanchese in North Carolina. So Wanchese had been a fairly sleepy port, wasn't that important in terms of landings early in the period, but became a major fishing port later on. So one of the lessons we learned from this is that the fishing industry we have now in the Mid-Atlantic is somewhat driven by the decisions that were made many years ago about expanding or not expanding ports, dredging, and so on. And I think this will help guide us in our thinking, today. Advance forward a number of years in my career, and this was only from a few years ago, and unfortunately, the person working with me on this project decided she wanted to go out and get her PhD, and we never completed it, but I wish I had, because I'd like to have updated numbers in this. But we looked at where the landings have shifted over time. So we saw diagrams in the two previous webinars of where the fish are moving or where they might be moving. And over this almost 40-year period, we see that, in fact, both in terms of pounds and in terms of value, that where the fish are being landed is moving further north. I have a question mark in terms of whether the fleets are actually moving, because I'm not measuring individual vessels in this particular case, or is it just that where the landings are, the ports that are more important are trending further and further north. And you can see that if we split the region into the north and the south, In fact, the fleets are diverging and moving in different directions. So fleets, part of the message here is the fleets do respond to the changing ocean conditions. A couple of more things that we looked at in that analysis was in terms of variability. So going from the early 80s to 2013, we see a market trend in the variability among the ports in any given year about where the landings are. So there's a lot more uncertainty, almost doubling over that period. Again, a response on the human side of it in response to changes in the fisheries. And the other thing we see with the graph on the right is the consolidation. So just looking at the top 3 ports, going from about 30 to 40% of the landings over that time period. So what did we learn from some of this? I like to break it down into sort of 2 major themes. So one is that what I would sort of call the internal margin, and that is sort of the analysis I was describing with the surf clams, where you have prices and you have abundance of fish in different areas. So you have costs of landing fish, and that analysis about where the industry would migrate to or not. But the other theme, and I think where we're really interested in developing these scenarios, is what affects that's sort of external from the direct fisheries world. And let's look at that as well. So the way I like to think about it is think about a decision. So there on the right, you sort of have the simplest example. A fisherman, a captain making a decision, for a particular fishing trip, a season, a year. Do they go fishing? What species, what complex are they targeting, and what area do they go to in order to do that targeting? And I think the important point for us here is that those decisions are made where the factors on the left in those boxes, and this is just a sampling of them, are relatively fixed in the short run decision that's being made. But in the longer run, these are the things that can change. So the first 2 webinars really talked about the stock conditions potentially changing over a longer period, over 20 years or so. What we're trying to figure out in doing these webinars is how do the existing management and regulations need to change in order to facilitate, the health of the industry or the stakeholders that are involved. The other things that are pretty fixed in the short run, but change in the longer term are, the capital that's invested in the fishery, the vessels that are available, the gear investments that have been made, the knowledge that the captains have about the fisheries. Again, the ports in the short run are fixed, but in the long run, those can change. The market conditions, certainly, what I was describing where there was individual port demand for different species and volumes of fish, that happens in the short run, but the broader market conditions can change, and we'll explore that in a minute. And also things in the community and family traditions and things like that, even those can shift over time. So let's look at one of these factors, the market conditions. And again, what are the external factors? So one way to think about it is that fish, seafood, and I know I'm focusing mostly on the commercial side, and not the recreational here. But fisheries are part of a bigger food system. And issues about how consumer demand is changing broadly, not just for seafood, but for all sorts of products. The food system relies a lot on trade, and we're seeing the impacts. We saw tremendous impacts of the pandemic on trade. We're going to see impacts from the war in Ukraine on trade. But the whole dynamics of trade, which really is important to seafood because it's one of the most highly traded commodities internationally, and how that evolves is really important for us to understand. Another thing that's changing, and I'll skip down, is this alternative protein movement as part of response to consumer demand. People want seafood that has less impact on the environment, Or maybe they don't want seafood. Maybe they want plant-based seafood. So we've seen that in plant-based beef, in plant-based chicken, and there is a movement for plant-based fish, and you're seeing more of it on the market. Another potentially disruptive technology is, the laboratory culture, cellular-based culture of seafood. Again, this is being done with meats as well. Right now, the technology is that it's very expensive to produce, maybe a couple of $1,000s a pound, but over 20 years, is that going to change as they figure out how to do that more efficiently? The other one I'll jump to is in terms of the technology that's changing and impacting the market conditions is aquaculture, of course. So that's a big one. And we have offshore aquaculture. I was just reading today how Cook Seafood in Washington State has just gotten permission that they can now grow steelhead in the net pens that they were using, in the cages that they were using to grow Atlantic salmon out in Washington. So we have the continuing growth of offshore aquaculture. I know there are problems or regulatory issues and things like that that have to be overcome, but folks are working on that. And then onshore is another big technology, recirculating aquaculture, that could be disruptive. Of course, you can, once you perfect this, you could do this anywhere, put the seafood production close to the market where it's going to be consumed. And at least now, there's a lot of fish growing on paper. If you look at the number of companies and their plans to grow Atlantic salmon in recirculating land-based systems, it ends up being, by the end of the decade, quite a substantial part of the current salmon consumption in the U.S. So, we got to pay attention to what's happening in recirculating aquaculture. So just as an example, because as Jonathan laid out, we're trying to think about scenarios. What would we do with this information? How would we use this uncertainty about the development of aquaculture, about plant-based seafood, about changes in markets, and so on? So one approach is sort of status quo scenario where we think demand is relatively stable. So we could just use the current pace and trends, maybe make some minor adjustments due to increasing population size and increasing incomes, which would increase demand for seafood, but just, sort of on that margin. But another scenario is this aquaculture expansion really puts downward pressure on the seafood market. And so fishermen are going to, in the future, get lower prices for their product. And then another alternative might be that there might be a backlash to that. And wild-caught seafood, in fact, would become a premium product to differentiate it from aquaculture product. And also it's something other than salmon. And I think we could look to the recent experience with oyster aquaculture and its expansion. I'm as guilty as anybody of expecting the market, the price for oysters to crash as we really exceed the expansion of oyster aquaculture based on the old demand. But in fact, what the industries have been able to do is get oysters out into a market and expand the market for it and maintain the prices at a pretty good level to support the costs of aquaculture, of oyster aquaculture. Now, on the cost side, and I'm not going to go through all the details, we don't have the time here, like I did on the market size, but again, what are the trajectories going to be? The distances to port, a lot of that's going to be driven by what the oceanographic and biological projections are. Fuel prices, I have to say, I'm glad I'm not an energy economist today. Your guess is as good as mine as what's going to happen given, again, what's happened to fuel prices. They're at record highs right now. But what's going to happen over 20 years as we do things like go to electrification of our vehicle fleet. So there are scenarios where energy prices go up, go down, but that's going to have to be considered in the scenario. And then for these last two on the crew wages and port facilities, I just want to jump to this. One of these graphics was in your briefing packet. So the 800-pound gorilla in the room is wind. And you can see there the competition for space in the ocean, and that is going to be a big issue. But I want to point out on this graphic that was provided by BOEM is their comment about, oh, this is going to create 80,000 jobs, which is wonderful. But where are those people going to live? They're going to live on the coasts. Where are they going to work? They're going to work in ports or port areas. So there's going to be competition for port space for fishing vessels versus those that are there to support wind energy. There's going to be competition for crew, in terms of wages and things like that. And again, that can be a good thing for crew wages. That's a positive, but it might make it more costly for the fishermen as they're trying to adjust. And so this is my last slide. And speaking about an adjustment, I just want to point out that I think the transition period is really the key here. And I sort of asked the question, if adaptation requires capital investment, well, it probably will. And who's going to provide that investment? Is it going to be the existing fishermen and processors and other industry members? Are they going to be new investors? What role is the government going to have in terms of sourcing that capital and investing in adaptation? And how do we deal with the transition of fishermen in the current period where maybe fish are leaving and they're fishing on a trailing edge of a resource, so their costs are going up, their landings are going down, so the revenues are going down, and they're going through an extended period like that, and then they're being asked to reinvest in sort of a new opportunity, maybe the leading edge of a resource that's moving into the area, but they've just gone through an extended period of low or no income and unable to build up their capital investment. And so ultimately, we have to figure out what management actions we can take to create the flexibility that incentivizes adaptation. So with the word transition on the slide, I'm going to transition back to Jonathan, since transition is a costly and risky area, but since we planned for this, I think I can transition back to him, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
All right, Doug, thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it. And yeah, just a great way of just outlining with a number of different drivers there, a number of different uncertainties. You're painting, quite different pictures of what fisheries might have to deal with over the course of the next 20 years or so, and transition is exactly right. So what I'm going to do now is I'll encourage what turn to the panel. I'm going to ask each of the panelists in turn their views on what they heard from Doug, and then also what else would they want to add to this conversation around what's changing in the social and economic environment of fisheries. So I'm going to go to Matt Cutler first. Before I remind you and encourage you, if you've got comments or questions, please put them in the chat there. We will be coming to Q&A a little bit later on in our program. So I would encourage you to react to what Doug said or react to any of the panelists and just add into the conversation that way. So first, let me go to Matt Cutler. Matt, your views on either what you heard from Doug or your perspective on what you see as some of really we think about the economic and social drivers affecting fisheries over the course of the next 20 years. Matt Cutler, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And so just as a way of introducing myself, I'm a social scientist up at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, and my background, as Doug suggested, is not economics, but sociology. And as a sociologist, I've been sort of trained to look at inequality and stratification in society. And as such, I've been serving as a member of our equity and environmental justice working group at the fisheries, throughout fisheries. And in that working group, we've been drafting up, some of you may be aware, a strategy document for how to handle and how to deal with and how to build on what we've been doing in this in the advancing equity and environmental justice, but really creating a kind of cohesive strategy that that strings together a lot of sort of very good work, but it's being done sort of ad hoc and on a regional basis and not as consistent. And so I think what's really key in building off of what Doug was talking about with respect to how in scenario planning we need to anticipate change and the distribution of opportunities or losses of opportunities for fishing or for delivering fish to market, for employment, in looking at how those are going to change over the next 20 years. Keeping an eye towards the equitable, distribution of the risks and the benefits that come from what's to follow, I think is really key. And so in our strategy document that we've drafted in this working group, I think one of the most important insights in there, and it's in the internal review phase now. I think it'll be going out for public comment eventually, and then the goal is to have it drafted up and finalized by the end of the year. But one of the key, I think, points made in our strategy document is that we really need to identify our underserved communities. We intersect with many underserved communities that are dependent on aquatic ecosystems for environmental, economic, and cultural health. But we don't really have a comprehensive understanding. We have a number of data products that speak to equity, environmental justice, and underserved communities, namely Voices from the Fisheries Archives have some great information in there. The social indicators of community vulnerability are a really great product for identifying, sort of geographic communities in terms and characterizing them in terms of their vulnerabilities along the dimensions of the social dimensions of being underserved and having environmental justice challenges. So we have some products, and then on a regional level, we have a number of surveys of crew and hire captains that we do, or vessel owners, cost surveys, things like that. But I think identifying where the vulnerabilities are going to be, and then the potential opportunities to offset the risks and the hazards that some may be disproportionately impacted by in a new kind of climate era. I think that'll be key, a linchpin to advancing, the equity and environmental justice in our work. And so in our strategy, kind of, I think a couple of the major areas that I really need to focus on are research and monitoring and outreach and engagement and inclusive governance. And so outreach and engagement, I think, is a beginning step. And in that, we mean basically, sort of trying to get an understanding of the full scope of the underserved communities that may be affected by NOAA fisheries-led programs or projects. But then also including folks, it's this idea of sort of co-production of knowledge. So making sure that we are including members of communities in underserved areas in the discussion of how the research is designed. We're providing opportunities and being clear and transparent about kind of what opportunities are available, and making sure that folks from underserved communities are aware of what we have for resources and how to apply for grants, how to apply for fellowships, things like that, but also bringing in community stakeholders to make sure that they have a stake in how our research is designed, and they really can help inform how our research questions are designed and how we actually go about producing research along these lines. That's a critical piece. It's not just about kind of going out and gathering demographic information to track demographic shifts, but actually engaging with, I think, community members in underserved communities and understanding kind of what's going on the ground is going to be critical to really informing, these broader demographic kind of tracking surveys that we do, which are great, but I think that's going to be a key and a critical piece going forward.
Matt, I want to
scenario planning.
Matt, thanks very much for that. I want to bring in Dr. Kathy Mills in a moment or two, but you raised some really interesting points there, and I want to also add that not only involving underserved communities, as you say, in kind of research design, but I think in many ways the kind of the point of this scenario planning is to be as inclusive as possible in really thinking about, well, what could some of these kind of changes mean for a whole range of different communities and different users. So I'm hoping that will be very much part of our work here in scenario planning as well. Okay, Matt, I'm going to go over to Dr. Kathy Mills. Kathy, your sense, again, same question. Doug gave us a kind of tour de force of all the kind of changes that are happening, some driven by climate, some driven by kind of other external factors. What struck you? What rose to the top in terms of what you feel is kind of meaningful to better understand how social and economic drivers of change are going to affect fisheries?
Yeah, I think there have been a lot of important topics raised by both Doug and Matt. So just to introduce myself to the audience briefly, I'm Kathy Mills. I'm a scientist at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute up in Portland, and I'm a fisheries ecologist by training, but a lot of my work looks at how fisheries are being affected by climate change, trying to trace those effects from the climate system through the populations to fisheries. And in recent years, I've been doing a lot of work around climate adaptation and climate resilience. And so I think what strikes me is really just the focus on the potential for adaptation in fisheries and how it intersects with a number of the issues that Doug and Matt both raised. So when I think about some of the scenarios that might arise in the future, I think that in my mind, it's really important to consider the fact that the impacts that we'll be facing will be determined both by the nature and the magnitude of the changes that occur themselves, but also by how well fisheries are able to adapt to those changes, how well we'll be able to buffer some of the impacts and also create new opportunities as the system changes. And adaptation can occur at many scales and actually needs to occur at many scales, including the harvester level, the supply chain, and within the fishery management system. So in the context of shifting stocks, for example, we've been working in several communities in New England trying to understand how they're thinking about adaptation, what are some strategies of interest to them, and some of the things that have come up routinely involve the need to adapt to changing species availability as the ecosystem changes. Fishermen view themselves as very entrepreneurial, able to take advantage of different opportunities as they shift. So they see themselves as adaptable, but the system they're operating in, the management system, as well as the market system, has changed in recent decades. And so thinking about adapting to shifting stocks, access to permits and quota is a hugely important issue, as well as the issue of cost and potential financing for those costs, as we heard Doug speak to in his comments. And I think it's also really important to recognize that adaptive capacity varies among our fisheries and even within fleets themselves. So large vessels may have greater potential to travel further to track fish as they move. Certain types of actors may have greater access to capital to buy quota or to buy permits and obtain access to different fisheries. And so as Matt raised, there are issues of equity that arise in this situation. In the supply chain, it's also really important that processing capacity and markets for new species align with those fishing opportunities to ensure that they actually have value and can be viable opportunities. And the fishery management system adjustments to keep the science on track with changes in the ecosystem so that we can avoid surprises and course corrections in sort of stock status and harvest expectations, and also thinking about the allocation side of our management system, the allocation arrangements that we have in place. The way we think about adapting to changing fisheries has to account for both the participants who are currently involved in those fisheries, as well as the potential for creating opportunities for future participants. And I think this is another very important equity issue that ties in with some of the work that Matt has been doing. So I think that those are some high-level themes that connect with some of the things we've heard, but I also think it's important to recognize that fisheries will be adapting in a world that's changing broadly. So the risk that will face fisheries in the future don't stem just from changes in the ocean ecosystem, but there are integrated risks that matter and that will affect the way fisheries might respond. So thinking about sea level rise and the threats that that poses to shoreside infrastructure, as well as transportation networks, is really important. And then thinking about some of the broader changes, societal as well as ocean use changes that we're seeing in aquaculture, offshore wind, and potentially a shifting balance between commercial recreational fisheries, as well as changing consumer preferences that affect market strength and the availability of markets for species that might be less familiar in a region now than they will be in the future. So I hope those are some interesting different insights, and I look forward to broader discussion.
Okay, Kathy, thanks very much for that. Yeah, that's it's a what you provided there in the last couple of minutes is a kind of a litany and a good long list of all the things that we're trying to really take account of in the scenario work. And your reminder, and it's great to hear that there's so many people kind of thinking about what exactly does this mean adaptation wise for communities. It seems a kind of natural play. I want to bring in Captain Tom Roller here. Either to follow on from what Kathy's been saying, Captain Tom, you might have a kind of sense in which, yeah, you can talk about adaptation and what's happening on the water, what's happening kind of coast side, and how things are changing. And then also, I'd love you to kind of maybe provide a perspective in what you heard from Doug in terms of what are the forces that you feel are really affecting your work now and really have the prospect of changing things in future. What's either causing pressure or causing opportunity for you? Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Just to introduce myself, my name is Tom Roller. I live in Beaufort, North Carolina, which is on the central part of the coast. I've been a full-time for hire fisherman for the past 20 years, and I currently serve as North Carolina's at-large representative on the South Atlantic Fisheries Management Council. I'm also serving on the North Carolina Marine Fisheries Commission, which oversees our state-managed marine resources. You know, and looking at the background document and listening to the conversation today, I kind of prepared some thoughts here regarding some of the main issues facing me as a for-hire fisherman, a recreational angler, as well as someone involved in management. My first point is I want to comment on the interconnectivity between federal managed species and state and interstate managed fisheries. This report clearly shows the vast importance of our state-managed fisheries across the regions to both recreational and commercial industries. Our state-managed fisheries tend to be more accessible to anglers, but despite that, our East Coast states have very different management systems that respond at greatly differing rates and demonstrate different priorities and values. These differences, I think, are going to become much more apparent as abundance and stock statuses change. I think this shifting of effort between state and federal fisheries will only get more complicated and create more financial stress for all segments of the fishing industry as things change. You know, my region is already experiencing considerable change in our fisheries abundance influenced by climate change, and fishermen are responding accordingly by moving to target what is abundant. I believe this has the potential to place even further strain on state and federal fisheries. I mentioned before that state fisheries are more accessible, but I see a further consolidation of angling effort to the stocks that are performing better currently. While stocks like striped bass are declining, effort and reliance on species like red drum and speckled sea trout are increasing. Consolidated effort presents further risk to the recreational industry. It's been discussed on previous webinars about how management lags behind the pace of change, and I'm concerned this lag will only become more difficult to deal with as things change and people further lose faith that management can work. You know, recreational industry is an extremely important component of our coastal economies, particularly in the Southeast. And it's important that we consider this economic footprint and general needs of abundance and management. I would stress that we need not just to protect access, but be more conservation oriented in our approaches to management and aim to protect access through protecting abundance, because abundant fisheries are the greatest insurance against climate change. The second point I want to raise is in regards to the changes to fishing infrastructure. Even in the face of more severe weather, such as recent catastrophic storms and rapidly rising flood risks, our coastal communities are growing rapidly. In spite of this risk, I am doubtful this will change in the next couple of decades. The for-hire industry is already facing extreme challenges with business infrastructure, regardless of the size of boats. In my area, conventional boat slips are becoming fewer and more expensive. Many private marinas have covenants against businesses operating from them, and the infrastructure we're gaining seems to be more centered around a subsection of private boaters, such as dry stacks, and are becoming increasingly more expensive and not feasible for business operation. The fishing industry is becoming more dependent on public infrastructure like boat ramps, but they are increasingly more crowded, and issues like limited parking and just the ability to have a place to clean fish often make these options increasingly less attractive and more difficult for all who use them. This is commercial industry, recreational industry, and private recreational. And this kind of builds on what Doug said. When it comes to for-hire and commercial fisheries, I fear this could lead to forced reliance upon remaining private infrastructure, which could lead to less autonomy and further constrained profitability. All of these factors affect the kind of water access infrastructure that's available as communities adapt. More specifically, they affect who can afford access and who can afford to rebuild after the kinds of storms and economic disruption we've seen in the past few years. I would argue that we must respond to storm damage faster, as the delays in providing financial assistance only further disadvantage the marine industry in the face of expanding development. And I'll end on this last thought. When it comes to recreational fishing, the report highlights decreased effort in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, but increasing effort in the Southeast. I think it's important that we ask what is driving these changes. What is influencing anglers' decisions? Is it because of changes that they're seeing in the resource, like changes in what's abundant or more accessible? Or is it decreased abundance in more accessible species like striped bass and bluefish? Are people responding because the fishing is good or bad? Or is it other economic factors or other ways of spending their time? To see stark regional changes is concerning to me, and as we plan and discuss the future, I think about future climate scenarios, it's important we consider these questions.
All right. Tom, thanks so much for that. Really appreciate it. And you raised some great questions, which I know will be part of the investigation here. And anyone who's listening in, please, if there are questions for Tom or for any of our panelists, please put them in the chat. I see a number kind of starting to come in here. Okay, let's turn. I want to turn to Rick Robbins now. Rick, thanks very much for joining us. Rick is the Marine Affairs Manager at RWE, and we wanted Rick to kind of to talk about one of the really very big issues that that Doug raised, and is certainly going to be very, very relevant as we think about the next decade or two ahead, and that's wind power off the East Coast. You may well have other things to kind of add as well, Rick, but I would love maybe to give the floor to you for a moment or two. We need to talk about what you see as some of the the challenges, the opportunities, the kind of realities of what these drivers and what these changes are going to mean for East Coast fisheries. Rick, over to you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jonathan. And just by way of background, I serve as Marine Affairs Manager for RWE, which is an offshore wind energy developer. I also have a background in commercial fisheries development, seafood processing, seafood exporting. I have a longstanding relationship with the state and federal fishery management process. I've been an advisor for a very long time through the ASMFC process, and then I served at the state level as a commissioner and manager with Virginia Marine Resources Commission, and served on the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council for 9 years. So been around the management process for a long time, and actually through that, I was exposed to the offshore wind industry development as it was just in its very earliest stages, and we were engaged at the council level with BOEM in the discussions about prospective development of offshore wind on the Atlantic coast. So as far back as about 2013, I went over and toured the industry in the UK and worked to understand some of the intersections between offshore wind development and commercial fisheries, and in order to understand what some of the challenges were with that, but also what some of the solutions were. And I think that there were a lot of great lessons learned just from that exposure to the fishing industry over there, to hear what their experiences have been, and also to see what role science could play and research and things like cooperative research to address some of the concerns, because there were a lot of parallels. There were a lot of fisheries there that were similar to ours. They had some of the same data challenges that we have on the East Coast, and I think in that there were a lot of opportunities to see how we might bring some of those best management practices, lessons learned, innovations, et cetera, into the U.S. Prior to the advent of that development. And I think you've seen some of that play out. But offshore wind, as has been pointed out, it is here. So according to the Department of Energy, the states are aiming for up to 40 gigawatts of renewable offshore wind takeoffs at the state level by 2040. So this is going to be a big factor. And I'm just thinking about Doug's talk. And Doug touched on the fact that there have been tremendous amounts of change in the U.S. fisheries, and particularly on the East Coast, but externalities have played a big role in driving those. He talked a lot about aquaculture and some of these other high-level things that have had major impacts and influences on the seafood industry, changes in consumer behavior, et cetera. But it's important to think about these externalities because if we think about them strategically, there's some things that we can anticipate, and clearly, we're at a point where we're on the cusp of development of offshore wind, so it's important to be thinking about this in those terms. But I think across all these things, we need to think about opportunities to identify strategies for adaptation, and specifically with respect to offshore wind. The process for development goes through BOEM's approach, which is a hierarchical approach to avoiding impacts, mitigating impacts, minimizing impacts. And so as they go through the siting process, they try to take into consideration all the different elements in the marine environment, and among those, fisheries are a very important component. So I think when we think about adaptation as this industry evolves, the need for adaptation is going to be a function of how well that first part of that process is done. And so if a project is really well sited through BOEM's process, then impacts are avoided. And beyond that, there are opportunities to avoid and minimize impacts if developers work very closely with the fishing industry, and effectively get the information about how fishermen fish in those areas, and get all the relevant operational details about the fisheries, and then integrate those into the design process. And if that's done well, impacts can be significantly and effectively minimized. And I think in that, there really are opportunities to have good outcomes. But as this goes forward, there are going to be important needs to monitor changes of marine resources in those areas. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity on the cooperative research side. And so that's something I think we need to think about very deliberately. And that's a strategic planning issue, in my opinion, because as you develop the need to have monitoring plans in those areas, I think one of the most effective ways to do that, and what you see evolving in the industry, is a model of cooperative research where commercial fishermen are engaged, academic partners are engaged, and they go forward and they use standardized methodologies to conduct things like trawl surveys to establish baselines, and set up a monitoring plan like that. But what's going to be incumbent on all of us to work collectively for, I think, is to make sure on the back end that those data are effectively integrated at a regional level so that they can be understood at a higher level, but also feedback into the scientific process on the fishery side, because the data that are going to be collected in there are going to be collected with a high frequency of spatial sampling intensity, and there's going to be a really tremendous amount of fisheries data collected. And I think it's important that we be very, very deliberate about making sure that those data are made available and feedback into the stock assessment process, for example. And I think there are going to be significant opportunities in that. But additionally, when you think about the adaptation, there are other things that come into play, because when you get to the end of that process and there's still outstanding adaptation needs, I think there are opportunities to consider how this new industry in the U.S. with wind energy development can work with the fishing industry to help support measures for adaptation. And and that could take a lot of different forms. I mean, I think there's been some discussion about gear adaptations and things like that. There are also opportunities to support improved marine electronics to facilitate operation within new arrays. But I think on that front, there will be opportunities, and in order to have the best outcomes, we'll have to work collaboratively to get at those. But I think that's very much in reach.
All right, Rick, thank you very much for that. I mean, if you have questions for Rick or comments on that, it's an interesting picture to paint there, as you say, about collaboration being key, whether it be on siting decisions, whether it be on the opportunity to kind of collect data, whether it be on the opportunity for adaptation in other ways. So lots to talk about there. Okay, our final panelist, Dr. Matt Mcpherson. Matt, I'll hand over to you here. Clearly, we've gone through a lot. Doug's presentation has taken us through a whole series of different social and economic factors that we need to be aware of. We've also heard a lot about the need for adaptation. We know changes are happening to all sorts of different communities. We know there are challenges to kind of recreational fishers as well as commercial. What strikes you as you think about this whole realm of how climate change is affecting fisheries? On the social and economic side, what looms large for you?
Well, speaking of being adaptive, I had a power outage right after Doug started this presentation, so I missed Doug's whole presentation as well as most of the panelists' comments, so I apologize if I'm being redundant.
Right.
Very strange thing. It hasn't happened in like a year, Murphy's Law. But I was struck by the first part of Doug's presentation, and I have been, one of the things I think that it's useful to think about that's been brought up is sort of how the dynamic interconnections between both the natural environment and the different communities and all the different economic impacts, and how we have to all these different relationships. And I'm thinking about specific cases here in the Southeast. I mean, here in the Southeast, there are a couple dimensions to climate change. One has to do with, I guess, the sensitivity of species to climate change, to water changes in water temperature, ocean acidification, and those things which affect sort of the movement, the range of populations. But we've been bombarded with disasters, different kinds of natural disasters that could be related to, and exacerbated by climate change. Things like freshwater intrusions, as you all know, hurricanes, all kinds of HAVs issues. So we've kind of seen a lot of these things playing themselves out in real life as communities struggle to, respond and adapt and rebuild to all of these different disasters. And in some cases, like in the case of Louisiana recently, in the Gulf, but just hammered by one hurricane after another. I think North Carolina's kind of been in a similar situation. We've been dealing with a lot of red tides. And what we've seen a lot is that, what might be a challenge for one community can often turn into an opportunity for another community. So these things shift around. So for example, the Fort Myers area was getting really, really hammered by a red tide event. And we went about 100 miles north up to Clearwater, right? Fort Myers was a disaster area. Everybody was worried, that was the end of the industry. We go 100 miles north, talk to the recreational fishermen. Recreational fishing is booming up there because a lot of the people who previously were going to go fishing in Fort Myers had moved up north to Clearwater, on the edge of the red tide. I mean, there are a whole series of these different kinds of, I think you see some communities that, are where the fishing activity, the ports are virtually wiped out, as a result of hurricanes, and others that come back stronger as maybe vessels from one community end up shifting to another community because there's better infrastructure, better opportunities, or that community was just lucky and avoided that particular disaster. So I think in thinking about resilience, it has to be kind of a big picture thinking, looking at sort of all the different relationships and where vessels may potentially move, and how a negative economic impact in one area could actually actually be beneficial to another area, and things like that. And maybe try to plan a little bit more around that, looking for where is the good infrastructure, where are the communities, where we're actually trying to research and trying to figure out, what are the resilience factors that communities that bounce back really strong have in comparison to those communities that don't bounce back. I think there's Talib talks about anti-fragile systems. And it seems like there are some communities that are anti-fragile, and it's looking for these sort of anti-fragile qualities. I think that is something that'd be really interesting. Another thing is just the whole idea, in management of regulatory flexibility. And that's something else that we've seen. I think the way fisheries management is set up right now, there are a lot of constraints like under laps, and the fishing community in like the red tide events, they were actually able to adapt pretty well. I mean, they requested a disaster, but when we went back and looked at the actual revenue losses, we found that vessels were able to struggle, shift into other fisheries, and they were able to make up an awful lot of the revenue. Now, that doesn't mean they were able to make up their profitability because they had to invest in moving around a lot more, but they were able to make up a lot of revenue by shifting and moving to other fisheries. But I know one of the things that that came up when we were talking to them had to do with how difficult it was to do that because, they were dealing with having to purchase, allocation. Communities that didn't, have access to IFQs, for example, for red snapper, were trying to figure out how to purchase, red snapper allocation so they could adapt, when other more inshore fisheries were shut off to them. So I think it's really important to when and other panelists that I heard, have made this point about thinking about really how to make the regulations, set up regulations such a way that they're flexible and adaptable for communities when they're facing constraints, that may come from disasters or from other, impacts of climate change. And then I think,
Matt, I'll hold you. Okay, let's give you maybe just one final thing. I want to move us on into a Q&A in a second or two. Just you've got a final point there.
Oh yeah, and then the last one just was about equity, and I heard that was brought up, and it's not only about monetary capital, but also social capital, and we've seen that when we've been doing research on hurricanes out in the communities, that there are certain groups that just have a real tough time getting access to the support structures, be it a linguistic thing or being some other isolation. The support structures that are in place, they can't access those support structures. So we really need to pay attention to, equity and environmental justice, who can access the systems that are in place to, to help people to adapt, and who are sort of shut off of those systems.
All right, great, thank you. Thanks everyone for that's just a very kind of a huge amount of kind of perspectives there, and very there's some common themes. Clearly the adaptation theme that's kind of coming out, but I think more than anything else, what I'm hearing from that is we know without a shadow of a doubt that the change is happening, whether that be from climate change or from some other factors. And then of course we know that we're starting to see changes in behavior or certain pressures kind of coming on, and that's really the most important thing to kind of have to deal with here is how are we going to adapt to everything that's going on. And whereas we've been talking here about fishing communities, the question about management and governance is really at the heart of what we're doing here in this scenario planning exercise. So it's like, how does management and governance adapt to all the changes that we're seeing? Doug, I want to come back to you in a moment or two, because you've been hearing everyone kind of reacting to what you're talking about, and then we're going to go into a Q&A. Before we do that, I just wanted to engage people a little bit in the questions that we've got here. And if you've been with us on the other sessions, you'll know that we've asked people to think about the different drivers. We put these in the briefing materials, so there are plenty of ways in which you can cut these drivers of change. Here's a few that I know we've talked about today. Population growth, Tom mentioned that. Cost factors, certainly Doug, you've mentioned a lot about that. Tom, very much the waterfront and infrastructure issues on that. Consumer demand, whether that be changing consumer values, maybe shocks to the supply chain, which we've seen over the last couple of years, international change, where sensing and monitoring or different food technologies, changing ocean uses, and then social vulnerability and environmental justice, kind of the makeup of communities according to kind of poverty levels and so on. So all of these we've just kind of bucketed 7 of them there as being potential drivers of change. I'd love to get you thinking about the couple of questions here. As you think about looking across all 7 of those, which of these do you feel might have the most impact on East Coast fisheries or your activities over the next 20 years? There are changes in each of these. which really rise to the top? I'm going to ask you in a moment or two to do a survey where you have to select 2 answers on that. And then the second question, of these social economic drivers of change, which ones do you feel are most unpredictable over the course of the next 20 years? Maybe some of these you're saying, yeah, they're important, but I know which way they're going to go. Maybe some things there are going to be more unpredictable. So what I'll ask you to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Kylie, if you can put the link to the chat there, the link to the survey in the chat. If I can ask everyone to click on that link, it'll ask you to continue. It'll take you to a SurveyMonkey survey where those questions that I just identified are replicated. Should take you no more than a minute to complete that. The one thing I'll remind you to do is you have to give 2 answers to each of them, otherwise it won't record your results. If you want to add anything else that isn't on that list of 7, there is an extra kind of comment box there, so please feel free to do that. So let me give you a minute or so for everyone to just go in, click on that link, put what you think is your perspective on what you see as most important and most uncertain, and then we'll see what results we get from that. Okay, I'll give it another 15 seconds to refresh again. Okay, so just if people can kind of take a look at that here, I've got, at this stage, I've got 56 responses. You can see there, most impact on East Coast fisheries. What's running largest there? Over half have given changing ocean uses. Remember, we had offshore wind and aquaculture as examples of that. So certainly we're seeing there that's looming large for a lot of people. Waterfront and infrastructure also feeling as if the changes going on there are going to have quite a significant impact. So that's a couple of notable ones on the impact. On the unpredictability, over 3/4 there, around 75%, looking at consumer demand or market dynamics. Clearly, we've had evidence of unpredictability in the last couple of years, supply chains being affected, and so on. Cost pressures, relatively unpredictable, and then technology change also with some significant scores there. So I really appreciate you doing that. Thank you. We may well get some more results in. I'll stop sharing that for now, but it's something that we'll definitely come back to. All right, so with that, back to you first now, Sean and Kylie, who've been monitoring the chat. Maybe we'll then look at some questions that have come in for our panelists. Doug, your reaction to what you heard from the panelists, what was there anything there that you thought, oh yeah, that's something that I would definitely kind of re-emphasize, or was there a pattern or a kind of connection or a thread that you saw coming out of the responses there that you think it's worth bringing up now? Hey, Doug, you're on mute. I think you're muted. Nope, can't hear you. Oh, no, still muted. All right, let's he can probably hear us, but I'm not quite sure. Hold on, let me just. Any better, Doug? Nope. Okay. No, we're gonna have to cut Doug off there a moment. Sorry about that. Let's see if we can kind of get him back. Sean, Kylie, anything? Let's go to you first, maybe, and just see what's coming in on the chat that we can go to our panelists with, and we'll see whether we can get Doug back on. Matt on the WebEx, if that's something you can work with Doug on, I'd appreciate it. Sean, over to you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, we've had a number of questions come into the chat, so thank you for everyone that's provided some questions. We probably won't have a chance to get to all of them, but we'll try and hit as many as we can here. So we'll start with David Dow asks, so what social, economic, and cultural tools are available to help coastal communities prevent the loss of working waterfronts, whether that be to tourism or other non-water dependent economic activities?
I know Matt, I probably would have directed that question to Matt Cutler in the first instance, but I think Matt had to drop. Kathy, could I ask you maybe to respond to that?
Sure, I can take a start. I think others can probably do a better job than I can, but I think that, I've been really impressed by how fishing industry participants speak to the importance of working waterfront protections and having things codified that certain piers and certain areas will remain as, for industrial uses. And so I think that having some of those protective measures in place, at least for some of the communities I've worked in, has been really important for providing that sort of ability to look out longer term and feel that you will still have the space that's necessary to operate a fishing business. And I think some of the actual business operators might be able to speak to that as well.
Yeah, Tom, what's your experience of this? What Kathy's talked about, either the kind of long-term commitment or anything else that you feel is important tools to bear in mind here?
I mean, I think that it's a big part of the discussion in North Carolina, in my community. I personally, I wish the for-hire industry was given a little bit more consideration, as well as the tourism industry. But I'm glad that it is continually being talked about and seems to be moving a little bit to the forefront of the conversation.
All right, thank you. Let me see, Doug, I think we may have you back. Let's check. Were you able to reconnect your audio?
I don't know. Can you hear me?
We can. Yes, got you.
Okay.
Now I can't remember what I was asking you. Basically, any thoughts from the kind of panel conversation of earlier, what you heard from everyone that you felt, oh yeah, that's something I'd really like to kind of emphasize, or a thread that you heard from this? Yeah,
that was the response. That was the thing I didn't get a chance to highlight. Like Tom's discussion about the for-hire fleet and the recreational fishermen. I thought that was, filling in the gap there. Matt's comments early, that covers our comments about environmental justice, equity issues. These are all the filling in, the key components. And I think what we're seeing is how expansive this is. I think one of the challenges for the scenario developers is how much of this do you want to take on? In terms of like changing seafood markets and aquaculture and building that into the scenario. Is that, maybe that is, I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but it adds a lot of work and adds another layer of uncertainty, to the scenario outcomes. Anyway, I just thought the panelists each had a unique perspective, which just demonstrates how, expansive this is. And I'm sure if we had two more panelists, they'd have, 10 other things that we didn't mention.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Doug. And maybe I'll respond to that as part of the kind of the group that's architecting the scenarios around this. And you're absolutely right that the problem with scenarios in an area as complex as this is that in some ways you're encouraged to think of everything. And we know that any of these factors could shape the future. I think where we'll end up is we'll have to focus on maybe a couple of different things, and we know we're heading towards thinking about changing stock distributions as being a real kind of focus of this work. However, all those other things are still storylines that we can imagine will want to play in one way or another, and particularly kind of storylines around, well, how will communities adapt to some of those changes? So even though we'll focus in some areas, all of this work is really, all of these perspectives are really valuable because we will want to play them in as elements of the scenarios as well. Okay, let me check with Kylie. Anything else coming up from the chat there of questions that we'd love to ask the panelists?
Yeah, so I have a question from Michelle Duval, and she is directing the question to Captain Roller. Have you seen client motivations change as the result of climate change? For example, moving from catching a fish to eat to catching for trophy motivations to catching for relaxation in nature, and has that influenced target species for clients?
Always a great question from Michelle. Yeah, absolutely. We've seen a lot of changes in that regard. And I can't really answer it from my own perspective because I don't think that would be fair. But the one thing I've seen from myself as well as other colleagues is that our clientele are getting used to change, meaning they're more accepting of the fact that maybe what they did 2 years ago isn't what they can do today. Or maybe a fishery is closed now and we have to target something different. You know, and part of this may be from the COVID era, but we're seeing a lot of people who are going to the water just to do something different, go fishing for a day and just keep enough fish for a dinner. And I think that's a great type of fishing effort that we need to see, right? But at the same time, I've also seen elements of the for hire industry shift, right? And their clients kind of follow that shift, meaning they're going to what's abundant, they're going to what's better, whether it be a state or federal fishery. I've seen it go both ways. So I think it's a little bit on both sides, but yes, client motivation has definitely changed, and perceptions and acceptance of what you can do has changed a lot. Thanks, Michelle.
All right, Sean, let's go back to you. See if there are any questions here. I want to bring Rick and Matt in on some of these as well. Anything else, Sean?
Yep. Yeah, I think I got a good one there. And I'll just make a comment before the next question that there's been a number of questions that have come in that are more sort of management related. And just to say that that's sort of the focus of the next phase of this scenario planning exercise, or actually 2 phases from now, is sort of how management will react to all the things that we're putting in there. And so we will be considering sort of the state and the federal management, how they might have to work together, and also highly migratory species and other things. So those will definitely be questions that we'll continue to work on as we progress through this process. And then the next question for the panel is something that's come up in a number of our webinars so far, and that's related to offshore wind energy. And so the question from Dave Monty is, offshore wind energy will help stem the tide on these climate impacts being discussed. However, offshore wind energy has enhanced recreational fishing at Block Island, even though fishing pressure has increased there over 200%. Offshore wind energy can and will have profound positive impacts on recreational fishing, especially if natural artificial reef designs are added to the base of pylons. Can we encourage enhanced structures? And if any panelists care to comment on sort of some of the positive benefits that might come out of offshore wind.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Dave. And so I'm based here in Virginia Beach, and 25 miles east of me, there are 2 turbines off the coast here that Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project has put in place. And if you haven't seen the underwater videos, you should. I mean, there's a nonstop cyclone of sea bass and other fish swimming around the turbines. It's quite a sight. But your question is one that has an engineering component to it, because the actual selection of scour protection is going to be informed, at least significantly, I think, by the sedimentation type there, and that's going to be identified through the geotechnical work that's done on site. And then, you know, how strong the currents are, what the needs are to ensure that scour protection is achieved. To the extent that there's flexibility in those selections, though, there may be opportunities, as you say, to consider those fisheries habitat that's created, because we have a lot of fisheries in the Mid-Atlantic that have really strong habitat associations. I mean, I think we already see that from the structures that are in the water. And fishermen who target those species know that. I mean, fishing on wrecks and other forms of structure. But I think you're right that it is going to create a tremendous amount of opportunity. Just here, some of the tackle shop owners have indicated they expect it to essentially create a new fishery. So that is going to be an important interface with this new development with the recreational fleet. But there are other considerations that'll have to go into the selection of scour protection as well, because if there are mobile gear commercial fisheries in the area, we'll have to take that into consideration, just as one example. But it's a good question. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Rick, for that. Let me check if there's anything else. Kylie, any other questions coming in there? Maybe a final question that we've got.
Yeah, sure. So from Janet and I, it seems like there are several events such as hurricanes, brown tides, heat waves that forced coastal communities to adapt that we can learn from. But how do we adapt proactively, or does it take an event to make adaptation happen?
Okay, so let's go, as Kathy, you introduced adaptation to this. I'll ask you maybe to respond to this, and then Matt Mcpherson, I'll give you the kind of final word, either in reaction to this question or anything else that you've heard, and then we'll go from there. So Kathy, over to you first.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we see around the country with extreme events, whether it's heat waves or HABs, that those do spur reactions and adaptation. And I would say, our best examples of adaptation in action have been these responsive, actions that have been taken in those contexts. But I think that, I don't see a lot of sort of isolated long-range planning of fisheries for adaptation with just fisheries, alone in the same way in terms of how fisheries operate and how their operational procedures might change. But I think there are a number of cities that have undertaken broader plans that have now incorporated an ocean component and a focus on fishing that may not have been there prior to the occurrence of these events. And so I think they're also bringing the, fishery discussion and ocean change discussion into these more integrated plans, even if they are, not necessarily developing on that topic alone, but we certainly see those long-range plans developing within the fishery management and fishery science elements of the arena as well.
Right. Thanks, Kathy. Matt Mcpherson.
Well, on that one, I agree that we see adaptation in action. So it's interesting to see how communities respond. I do think that we need to, in fisheries, we spend so much time just trying to get a sense of what the impact has been and trying to provide some sort of response or disaster relief, that we haven't really had as much time as we would like to, have a better understanding of how communities actually have adapted and what are the factors that have made communities able to adapt or maybe not able to adapt, so that we could then inform management and be more proactive and make those proactive recommendations, both for fisheries and more broadly for the community. So I think it really is important that as we experience these things in real time, we're learning from them as well. So we can take those lessons learned and we can integrate those into the kind of management and policy approaches that we adapt.
Great, I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. And let me just add one thing on this. It strikes me that, and maybe we haven't talked about it in these terms, but how do we adapt proactively? In many ways, what we're trying to do with scenario planning here is very much about this. It's saying, let's imagine future conditions or future circumstances where we may get shocked, where things might happen where we don't want them to happen, or some other changes that kind of coming about that we haven't anticipated. The very fact that we're thinking about those in advance or rehearsing the future, the purpose of doing that is then to say, well, maybe we can be better prepared. So it's certainly not the only answer, but I'm hoping that what this scenario planning work does, both in terms of governance and management and also preparation for coastal communities and fishing communities, is in some ways helping to get those communities to kind of adapt proactively. So I think it's a part of it. It's certainly not everything, but it's very much a part of it. I want to thank all our panelists. Doug, thank you for kicking us off there with a great presentation that covered a lot of ground. Thanks so much to all our panelists. One of the things that we've tried to do in this webinar series is very much just bring you a range of perspectives, not because we think this is simple. It's not. Doug, as you said, there are so many different kind of angles and dimensions to what we're doing here. And in many ways, we wanted to just bring that kind of confusion and complexity really up to the fore. There's a lot for us to think about. The next stages of this are very much now trying to create a set of a handful of scenarios that try and at least get us thinking about what that complexity means and how we might want to deal with that. So just as in the final seconds that we've got together here, I just want to explain where we're going with the next stages of this process. In the next couple of months, we're now going to be preparing for a scenario creation exercise, workshops, and we'll use some of these drivers of change, not all of them, but we'll use some of the most important ones to create this kind of handful of scenarios, really exploring now the question about how will climate change affect East Coast fisheries in a range of different dimensions over the next 20 years. To Doug's point, we can bring in all sorts of different things here. Oceanographic conditions will combine with biological conditions, will combine with social and economic conditions. We're not going to talk about what will happen. They're not predictions in and of themselves, but they will be these kind of challenging, relevant, memorable stories that describe what might happen over the next 20 years. And if we're imagining what those things might be, then maybe we then can be better prepared if those shocks happen in future. Very much that kind of proactive adaptation. And so let me just go back a moment. Later on in the year, we'll then use those scenarios as a platform for the ultimate discussions here about future fishery governance and management issues. So for example, once we've created these different scenarios about the different conditions, we'll be asking questions like, well, what are the particular challenges that governance and management would face in 10 or 20 years' time if this scenario happened? How would our current fishery governance and management arrangements cope if these new scenario conditions were to occur? Maybe they'd be fine, but if they wouldn't be fine, then what would then need to change in our management to prepare for these scenario possibilities? As Doug said earlier, how do you ensure that governance and management encourages adaptability in transitions? And then ultimately, this is all about what are the tools and processes that we need to now put in place or need to be advanced now in order to ensure that fisheries are governed and managed effectively in an era of climate change. And so that's really where all of this scenario conversation is going. The next couple of months are going to be about creating the scenarios. Then the next part, the next half of this year is really going to be some of these really important conversations with a whole range of different stakeholders around what we think really needs to be happening with governance and management. And then the project outputs, the overall initiative outputs there, will get to the set of scenarios. It'll be giving us a better understanding of the challenges and opportunities facing fishery management in the future. I think we're already getting towards those. Then really thinking about those kind of sets of management priorities, a list of data gaps. You know, we heard a lot today about the way in which we need to understand systems better. And then I think more than anything else, the scenarios will provide us with an ongoing kind of framework for conversation and idea generation. So with that, I'm going to just check with Kylie and Sean if there's anything else on the logistics front that I haven't mentioned at the moment, and see if there's anything we need to share with panelists and with attendees right now. Sean, Kylie, anything else from you?
Not from me. Thanks to everyone for participating.
All right.
Yeah, The only thing I would add is that all three of these webinars will be recorded and up on the website in due time, and then so you can go back and watch any of them if you're interested.
Great. Thanks again to everyone and for attending. If you've attended all three of these or just one or two or three of them, we really appreciate you taking the time to do this. As Sean said, we will be putting the recordings of these up. We'll be creating a summary of them, and we're now in really good shape for starting to create these scenarios, which is the next part of this process. Thanks again for all your time, all your questions, and your engagement, and we look forward to continuing the conversation as we start to create the scenarios. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a good afternoon.